So the title here, The Outlook for Political Civility and Compromise in the Trump Age. Not good, okay? Done. Interestingly, though, the issue at hand is that I really want to personify as we, in the American political life, over-concentrate on individuals. We over-concentrate on the presidency, when in fact, the lead up to this has been decades long. And the rollout of this does not end with Donald Trump, no matter what happens. So whether you like the current politics or not, this is where we're at, and there's no easy way out. Secondly, this is not, for those of you who are pro-Trump or anti-Trump on either side of this divide, just know that you're going to be unhappy with what I say. It's good when both sides are unhappy. We're in a deep division right now. Thank you, thank you. And the division here is not new. It didn't start in 2016. Donald Trump didn't create this. These are not Trump voters, contrary to what we've heard, and anti-Trump voters. These are voters that have been out there for decades and have been percolating to this point. So the narrative here is that this deal maker comes in and, for a broken Washington. Washington is broken. There is no compromise. Some people don't want compromise. That's the thing. And compromise sometimes in American history is really, really bad. So for one, the normative component of what we say with that, we have to be extremely careful. The negative tone and incivility is at high points. We've had it, as we'll see here, in the past. This is not new. It's different, as we'll see. That doesn't mean it's good or okay. And this notion as well that had resonance in 2016 has been around for a while too, that there is a threat to America, and this threat is aimed both ways. The threat that Trump projected about Islam, about immigration, is not new. He did not create that, as we'll see. We have data going a long way back on that. And in turn, the people on the other side of the fold here believe such talk is itself a threat. So the threat felt is genuine on both sides. It's not a gut level thing either. This isn't, we are overly caricaturing the other side and saying, well, they're simple people or something. As we'll see, these are the most engaged partisans on either side of this. This is not something that we can teach it out of people. This has been taught in for decades. So there's no easy way out. And we now need to look at political correctness too, which is something that certainly came up in the campaign as something deeper than what we kind of talk about here on campus. That political correctness, in fact, is a very deep concept, and it means different things to different people, as we'll see. This didn't come out of 2016. Again, this comes out of research that I've done with some colleagues for a while. Okay, how does political change in the US happen historically? Our models really in political science, particularly in party politics, have been that America is a pretty stable place, which is good. Our constitutional system remains kind of intact over history. We have kind of some interruptions at moments in time we call critical realignments, where the American public kind of goes crazy, right? Luckily for us, the American public goes crazy on the party system. And for many scholars, this is great because it protects our Constitution from populism. We kind of, like the Kool-Aid pitcher come crashing through a wall, but it's a wall of our party system, not of our Constitution. On the other side, though some political scholars say this is actually a very good thing, we have kind of too much of a, our Constitution isn't alive enough to allow enough democracy, and so what happens is that this built-up frustration occurs, and boom, these are finally moments of democracy. Whatever your view is, historically, we've kind of viewed American political change as being punctuated equilibrium, as it's called, these large moments of change, and then stability for a long time afterward. For about, if you do your math here, about 30 years. We were supposed to have one in the 1960s. If you believe the 30-year tradition, all my students in here, like Matthew, know this along. I see others shaking their heads. They know this. It's been beat into them over time. It didn't happen. Political scientists were looking. All the indicators were there that it should happen. We have political assassinations, third-party challenges, all this other stuff occurring. It didn't happen, and party scholars were looking side to side, and in fact missed a lot of the trends that did happen that we're going to be talking about today. That we were waiting for like the tornado to hit, and in fact it was a slow change, what we refer to here as a secular realignment, a slow rolling out of partisan change and shift of who made up the Republican Party and Democratic Party over time. And this shift occurred surrounding a lot of unresolved issues that normally would have been resolved in one kind of massive election and downfall of one party. Did not happen that way. And it didn't happen that way for some good explainable reasons. We did have big elections in the 1960s, but they slowly led to changes to where we are today that took about a 40-year rollout to really come to full fruition to be where we're at today. What happened? In 1964, a horrible year for Republicans for the presidential level, except for was a big moment of change, right? So you have a presidential candidate who was outside of the mainstream of his own party. And he gets smoked everywhere, except for he wins the South dramatically and uncommonly. So the lesson learned, in fact, Goldwater was proving this. He thought the Republican Party was too northeastern. He was really upset with Richard Nixon in 1960 for going northeastern. And so he gets killed in the 1964 election. Democrats think happy days are here again, passing civil rights legislation, which then set off a change within their own party. Southern conservative whites, no matter whether you think it's racism or what, the racial issue is more important in the way we study it. This was a political issue for them as well. Their political survival was on the line because you've opened up the doors to people whose long history then has been political control by not allowing African Americans in. Big moment, to be sure. In 1968, we see this moment kind of come through with a third-party run that wins the Deep South, right? So George Wallace wins the Deep South, and we always talk about it being part of the civil rights era. Wallace was an interesting guy, if you think about these issues that I'm pointing at here. Law and order, the U.S. role in the world. These were dividing the two parties. The race issue clearly was. Vietnam was. These are not issues distinctive themselves. They're broader issues. The role of race, that's not a new issue. That was around in the founding and continues to be. Our role in the world, Vietnam was one component of that, but still there's much more to that. The role of the American federal government relative to this. We missed some of those issues in the 1968 because we concentrated on Wallace and segregation. But Wallace's running mate, anyone know who Wallace's running mate was? Curtis LeMay, right? The guy that told Kennedy to hit the button and just take care of Cuba. Yeah, we'll lose the Eastern Seaboard, but hey. That is a role, that's a hawkish view that was very, this is part of these worldviews as we see that were shifting. In 1972, Richard Nixon was not going to lose the South. And as Goldwater had told him, you should go hunting where the ducks are. You should go to the South where the conservatives are, and he did. And forever, this has changed. Jimmy Carter won some southern states. Bill Clinton won one or two. But forever, we have seen the Republicans dominate the South. They did not dominate the South in congressional elections because you had incumbents. We know incumbents served for 20 to 30 years. It took a long time. They did not change. They were conservative Southern Democrats that took till the 1990s to be replaced by Southern conservative Republicans. As this occurred, the Republican Party's appeal changed with Ronald Reagan along many of these issues. conservatism and social conservatism, and also, obviously, as we talk about with the military, et cetera, this Reagan was central casting for the final win in the South, right? But this appeal, as one conservative party scholar from the Northeast has mentioned, when parties make strategic decisions, there's payoffs that are negative as well. And what happened is about a 10-year lag behind winning the South finally through this slow process for the Republicans. There is a rebound effect of losing the Northeast to the Democrats, right? That same Democratic or Republican divide between the Rockefellers, between the George H.W. Bushes and Ronald Reagans, voodoo economic kind of thing. That comes back by the 1990s and 2000s. So what we see is a kind of a slow change that occurs to get us to the point where we have these differences. Now, if you look at the US Congress, there's a kind of a debate that we have going in American politics about whether or not, by the way, how polarized is the American public? If you watch the news, we're totally polarized. But other scholars say we're not that much. What we have is a distinction. We have elites that are extremely polarized. The American public is not. And we're confusing this kind of polarization of the elites with the American public. In fact, the story is that there's a disconnect between the people and their leaders. And these moderate people want, more moderation. I'm going to get rid of that. So the moderation, then the disconnect is the story. That they're in fact not very, this is not a better story, no matter how it works out here, as we'll see. That we are either polarized and never to be friends again, or we have elites that are polarized and out of step with us. This is a deep debate that goes on, as my students can tell you. But at the elite level, there's no doubt. This is the US congressional distribution between 1970s and now. And what you see is there are no crossovers anymore. So that's the elite level, to be sure. What about the American public? How divided is the American public? We are divided, as we'll see. But what we're divided by is not simply this ideological component. And that's important in what we're talking about with the Trump age now, because it is a separation on worldview, an outlook that is a little different, as we'll see. That these issues that we talked about, and we'll talk about again, the inability to deal with the race issue, inability to deal with the gender issue, inability to define what America's role in the world should be. We never came up with answers to it. Instead, we beat each other over the head. And as that happened, and we slowly changed and kind of took worldview out of one party and put it in the other, another worldview out and put it in the other party, we've left ourselves enormously divided based on party identification that is not very ideological, as we'll see. Not necessarily. We call it ideological, but it's not tax cuts and other kind of things. What is this worldview divide? This is by a couple of scholars, Mark Hetherington and Weiler, and their discussion is at the end of this slow realignment that I've talked about, where Northeasterners became liberal Democrats rather than liberal Republicans, right? And Southerners went from conservative Democrats to conservative Republicans. What you've seen is this divide occur on what they talk about on worldviews. Now, I call it law and order worldview. This is, in their term, authoritarianism. I don't like the term. It's an old literature, however, and I'm sure my psychology friends and sociology friends know this literature goes way back. Authoritarianism is kind of a pejorative term, so I don't like to use it. If we think of the core here, it is people who believe in the need for social order, believe in law and order, believe that the social status quo, there's nothing wrong with it, don't go shaking it up. In fact, that disrupts American society and disrupts who we are, right? In turn, and the story that never gets told, are those on the other side here, the anti-authoritarian worldview. It's often set off that authoritarians, in this case law and order, let's put it this way, people that don't believe that social change is necessarily good, that it could be threatening to the American way of life and who we are, that a breakdown in the social order is not good, that we should let authority run, and order is good for society first and foremost. There's an opposing view, and we don't often think that opposing view points back and is itself a worldview. It's not the kind of catch-all category. Is itself a political view that we see in action, we don't often think about it. That for the White House, after a Supreme Court decision making gay marriage constitutional, that lights up the White House in the color palette, right? That is a worldview on display that many of us probably don't think of it, but to somebody viewing it from another worldview is like, what are you doing, right? That is an important kind of challenge here. So it's not, the story is always about the law and order. It's not. It's a two-way street here. And these are deep set, and they are now deeply in our party system. They have evolved with other issues, especially over the last few decades: abortion, affirmative action. Remember the race issue? We have not let that go. Iraq, terrorism. What do you do with a terrorist? Do you torture them? Or is that not who we are? These are very, these start to kind of be a deeper division. We've looked at them on their own, but they are not in the sense of this worldview that now is part of the two-party system here. And so this slow change has led us to a point where we, in fact, have what's referred to as negative partisanship. And this is really where my colleague Dan Shea at Colby College and Sharice Strawn at Central Michigan, this is where our research jumped in. We kind of jumped in a little earlier than some of this stuff had gotten finalized. But this negative partisanship, there's a new literature coming out. Ours, we're out a little bit front of it, that really the story of party identification these days and strength of party identification is more a story of disliking the other side more than liking your own party, right? And we call this a second layer, right? We can think of the head part of ideology and being different. This is the heart part, right? And we often think, though, this gut level stuff is just for kind of people that don't pay attention to politics. To the contrary, it's actually the people most engaged in politics who have the most gut level feeling toward this. So we're not going to teach this out of people. We're not going to kind of kumbaya this one. This is deep and genuine. And for those that are scared by this, political scientists are. If you read the textbook, the same textbook I have my students read right now, if you read that 30 years ago, they were saying, oh, wish we could have parties that made a difference, right? Tweedledee and Tweedledum, right? Will Rogers stuff. We just wish we had parties. Well, now we got them. Be careful what you wish for. But the question is, where do we stand with this? And the issue is that these issues unresolved lay out there and end up cheesing each other off worse and worse as we go on. And so this is the important part here. And so what does this come through? I want to put up these. These are actually from a senior seminar. I helped a student do this. Sarah Beatty was a psychology, some of my psychology colleagues here. She did this for a senior seminar. So these are thermometer ratings. How well do you like your party? And this is over time. So as I said, this a slow roll between the two parties. What you see here is no one likes their party anymore than ever. They like them less. Even the strongest partisans like their party less than they used to. But they really don't like the other party. Thermometer rating, how warm do you feel toward it? You see they're just dropping off. Over half of the positive feeling toward the other party is just completely dropped off entirely. And it's not just the Democrats that Republicans hate. It's the same on the other story, right? So that's those early 70s, by the way, that's just Watergate. So who thought Watergate would lead to anything good? But apparently made people like the other party a little bit. But anyway. Now, so what I'm saying here is that very much this Trump age and Trump voters aren't really a new thing. The Trump voter has been there and ready to go. And the opponents to the Trump voter have been there, ready to go as well. So where we're at is where we have been making ourselves for a long time. But here, for my research, it makes compromise less likely, civility less likely, and it drives a cycle toward there's no off-ramp on this set of divisions here. So let's start with one area promised to be talked about today, in political compromise. All right. Now, the division here on political compromise, we kind of have in a normative sense that we need political compromise. That political compromise is, in fact, that which refines the will of the people, right? And brings better outcomes. Win-win situations. There's no win-win situation, right? Our game theory and other people that do this, they're very difficult to come up with win-wins. So we should not fool ourselves. But this social desirability, as we'll see, has become less and less over time. People might state it a little bit at the beginning, but in the actuality, there's a view of a lot of kind of compromising as a selling out. And this is a view that's not equally shared between the two parties, but as we'll see, compromise can in fact be viewed as something that is dangerous. And in fact, also here, the ways out of it, how do you get people to compromise in a system that's not working? Get them to deliberate. Well, we'll see how that works here in a couple minutes. So let's look at the party divisions. These are from two 2010 surveys that we did, national surveys, and a 2012 national survey that happened after the election. So kind of cooling off, maybe a mandate had occurred. And as you see here, Republicans are much less willing to compromise. In the 2010 election, you can see you're the out party. You know, the other party's got the majority. So maybe it's a conditional thing. Pew has done this study since the early 1980s. And in fact, Republicans are always less willing to compromise. And Democrats are always much more willing. That's probably a condition of Democrats coming from a coalitional party that had to bargain with itself anyway. But regardless, the feelings here are very different, and probably heightened, though, by Republicans feeling they're out of power now. I wonder if we had this survey, I keep looking at Pew, when are you going to field this to see what's it like now with Democrats out in the cold, how much they want to. But regardless here, what you see is that there's very different views on compromise based on party, right, to be sure. And what heightens this further, though, is that this is when you're asking, do you want politicians who stand firm or compromise? When it actually gets, we ask the secondary question, how about yourself? When would you compromise on a set of issues? And so we fielded these issues, deficit, healthcare, immigration, abortion, social policy. The social policy actually, it said like gay marriage, so it gave an example. And what you see here is, not surprising, as you go from the more kind of easier budget-based issues, you move to where the Democrats don't want to compromise either. I don't want to compromise with somebody on these deeper set of issues. So in practice then, again, it's even gets complicated by the reality of politics and about how these issues go as well. But we also, it's kind of a little too simple to just put it in those terms. So we also asked people their own view of politics. We had an open-ended question, and this was an automated survey, so we could record their answers. And so I'm actually going to play a couple. We asked people, so what do you think of compromise itself? What does it mean to you? And what we see here is that some people just out and out reject compromise as bad. Some view it as negotiated, but the real thing here is that there's a partisan difference about what it means. And some of its effect might have been the condition of the time, to be sure. 2012, Barack Obama had just won. But these differences are are pretty fundamental. Let me get it. Hold on, get it out of here. All right. Okay, compromise. Here is kind of a view of compromise as something functional.
Political compromise.
Hold on.
Political compromise is getting shit done, whether it's good for your party or not, more whether it's good for the United States.
Extremely functional, that one. So here's another one. This would be very common.
Yes.
Political compromise to me means, what do you think?
It means
That you work together to get something done, and
it's something you don't like.
even if it's something you don't like. Ooh, that's good. I like that. Even if
I like that. She's very cute. So, then there is others that kind of view this as a tactic here. Then, so our categories with a tactic here.
Compromise is having other people do what you want them to do politically.
All right, this is Machiavelli right there. Then we get to some of the views of this being a threat.
Political compromise is not giving African Americans free handouts.
Whoa. There's more to come. I hope you came ready, because there's a lot of love in the room.
I think compromise is giving in, is not standing up for your principles. I do not like compromise.
All right, there's more. Hold on.
Compromise is deadly. We need to stand firm on principle. We need to return to what our founding fathers brought to this country. Principles. Principles from the Bible. This country is on a slippery slope. It's been...
Okay, I'll give you a couple more here. These are deep felt. You hear the emotion?
Compromise is very important, but Obama wants everything his way, and his way is the wrong way. He is an idiot, and he will not compromise or do things the way he wants. He wants to have the illegal aliens come in and treat them right and let them have our jobs. He wants to ship all of our jobs to China. He wants to shut down the coal mines.
This goes on.
Compromise, to me, politically now is meaning Republicans caving to Democrats, because it certainly never goes the other way around. The Republicans historically are the ones that need to be having to shed principles.
So that's more principle that they are not alone here. Well, this is a two-way street, as I mentioned.
It means Republicans not obstructing each and everything that comes along, and trying to work with somebody rather than being pig-headed about it.
So there's a couple other, so what I think what's visible here is there's a sense that that it's not necessarily good, that it can be extremely negative, to be sure. And so when we talk about this, if you want civility to occur, then it's a little easier if you have power, to be sure. But these are different views of why we should even have compromise, and pretty well stated why they think it's selling out. And this is a real attitude, a real view here. Now, how do you get over it? Classic, deliberate. And the literature on deliberation, by the way, is tremendous. If you talk to somebody who you disagree with, you become smarter and more empathetic to their position, and we come up with better decisions. It's deep literature in political science. So, of course, I beg to have these questions put in about how often you disagree with somebody. And as it turns out, the story is not always good. As Democrats talk more with people who they disagree with, they become less willing to compromise. So there's people that want to compromise, they're suddenly like, I don't want to compromise. All right, now Republicans the more this is the story, the more they did talk to people with whom they disagreed, they did get more willing to compromise. But in fact, in the higher order models, when we put all the controls in deep and really bang the data, what we came out with is Republicans became less likely to totally not want to compromise. It's not wanting to compromise more. So this idea of deliberation, the stuff I spent a lot of time in my research life going after to improve American political life, is not necessarily an easy key over. So compromise already wasn't doing well, let's say, before 2016, to be sure. How about civility? This is where we'd actually started this research project. And civility, the political sciences looked at it differently increasingly. That it's more of a tactic than it should be viewed as a kind of just mismanners or something. And what we find here is that the increasing lack of civility is blamed not, we don't find a good place to blame here. And it didn't come along with Donald Trump. It didn't come along with the Tea Party. It's been brewing ever since we started with this slow roll, right? So let's take a look at some of the civility here. Who's to blame for, in 2010, the growing incivility in the United States? As you see here, the blame just simply goes to other actors. No one takes any ownership of their role here in this. That's not, that shouldn't be a surprise that we have that. But how is this historically, and where do we sit? One of my colleagues did a study where they did a Google search of books. And when they discussed a certain set of terms, nasty politics, rude politics, and remember those moments of realignment that we talked about. So interestingly, these, you probably can't see that well, but books came out about 10 years after major realignments that had a lot of negative words in them. Nasty politics, dirty politics, and all this other stuff. So these spikes in words in books describing nasty politics come at these moments of realignments we should expect, explosion of political activity. What's interesting is, if you note down here, this slow rollout, as we said, of the slow realignment has ratcheted up incivility, at least as it appears in political books. So what we note is that this political incivility matches what we've seen other times. It's just slower right now and probably more of an ache than an immediate pain. But the question is that we've always said, hey, political incivility turns people off, right? Not so. Some people were surprised this year with how responsive some of Trump's voters were to him. These voters have been there, as we'll see. In 2010, we asked people, if you note the question here, these are people that said that 2010 was the nastiest campaign they'd ever seen, okay? Took them, and then we asked them, is this good for democracy? They said, no. So these people that said 2010 was bad for democracy, nastiest, did it mobilize you? You would think, bad for democracy, I'm not mobilized by that. Look down here, if you see, Democrats were turned off, all right? It wasn't a good year for them, to be sure. But if you look up here, those that wanted politicians to stand firm, that were Republicans, 60% of them said, yeah, it's bad for democracy. Yes, it was an awful year for it, but it turned me on, right? It got me jacked up. This is where we're at. If you look at negative partisanship and view this second layer of, this is not a surprise that people would be more driven and that people would turn out to vote and that people would be turned out to vote against the other side, right? So this is important then if we look at 2016, two candidates that might not have been that popular certainly weren't. Didn't mean it was any less mobilized. They were just mobilized in the opposite direction. And so this is the key here. Now, we'll talk about civility in that in a minute. But I want to talk about one additional area of polarization here. And this was an accident of history, to be sure, but probably tells something about 2016. 2016 certainly We have a candidate who highlighted fear of Islam, fear of immigration in a way that earlier candidates of his own party did not, to be sure. How did this mobilize? Remember Jeb Bush at one of those first debates saying, "Really, Donald? All Muslims? Really?" What happened to Jeb Bush? Right? He was visiting us, right, instead of running. This was, this is a deep set thing. It didn't happen with Donald Trump. These is part of the worldview that has slowly been developing, and we have evidence already of it that we happened to catch 6 years earlier. So in 2010, you might have remembered the 9/11 mosque, the cultural center that was going to be put near Ground Zero, and the controversy that surrounded that. We ended up in a natural experiment. My colleague Dan, in our September survey that year, said, hey, you know what, with this 9/11, let's put a question in there, asking people if they think it's appropriate or not for political commentators to say negative things about Muslim Americans. Now, for the social scientists out there, you're like, that is the worst question ever. It's double-barreled, it's asking you 50 different things. It's true. But that's my friend Dan. He likes to just get stuff out there, right? When it came back, as we'll see here in a minute, it came back extremely partisan, the results to that. As we'll see here, Republicans are very much saying it's appropriate. But the question is, so what? I mean, freedom of speech, right? And we didn't have a why. And so for the wave right before the election, we did voice captures like we did here with open-ended responses. We asked them if they said it's okay to say negative things, why is it okay? And we'll hear some of those in a minute. But right beforehand, right before we hit the field, is when Juan Williams went, the commentator for NPR, went on the O'Reilly show and said that he was scared to be on airplanes with people dressed in Muslim garb, right? Then the whole furor over whether he should have been fired by NPR for freedom of speech hits. So of course we're ruined, right? Because we've now treated the whole American public that we're about to ask with a set of questions that's freedom of speech, right? So there's no way we can really get to the bottom. As we'll see, we still got to the bottom of what people's attitudes were, and we're telling here. What we found, okay. So party identification, clearly Republicans thought it was more appropriate than anyone else to say, for political commentators to say negative things. Not a big deal, because you can say that's for freedom of speech or whatever. Democrats very much thought it was inappropriate here in a minute. Now, what's driving this? Is this, some gut level thing of people that don't know anything about Islam or something like this? In fact, we double checked by how attentive they are to politics. Those people that very closely follow politics were actually much more likely to say it is appropriate if they were Republicans, and it's less appropriate if they're Democrats. So this isn't some people, not watching, not paying attention, or not attentive to politics. These are the most attentive people, where this divide is the greatest. So this worldview thing, again, is not some simple aspect. So we coded those. I'll let you listen to some in a minute. The open-ended responses. It had, all of the measures of intercodal reliability, everything. And this is what we found, is that we kind of had two political correctness answers. One was a very First Amendment oriented, right? That, you shouldn't be putting politically correct shackles on anybody with freedom of speech. We had a second anti-political correctness point here that is extremely important. We had, obviously, we're at war, huge percentage of people, and Muslims are a threat. I'll let you listen to those as different than the political correctness one. This political correctness issue then kind of enlightens something. Political correctness in the way that, for instance, Donald Trump talked about it during this election. Doesn't mean political correctness and kind of free speech or campus free speech and this kind of thing. It is a notion that any type of political correctness is actually a threat to the United States because it's shrouding the real dangers that we're facing today, all right? And so I'll let you listen to this. That is the biggest answer. The responses we got were, we shouldn't be doing this because it's politically correct, but not, again, for the First Amendment, but because we are kind of missing the danger. You're shutting us up when we're warning you about how dangerous this is. So I'll play a couple of these. Again, be warning, there's no dirty words in this one, but these are kind of vivid, let's put it that way. Ah, crap.
Anybody can say whatever they want. It's the freedom of speech.
So that's the freedom of speech type. There's another one of these here.
Free speech.
Boom, done. Now these are the threats. These can get a little edgy, so.
Because, you idiot, we're under attack from the Muslim religion. And anybody that can't figure that out has rocks in their head.
Because I don't trust any of the Muslims anymore. I wouldn't be comfortable around them, even the ones that have professed to be Christians. They were born and bred.
Hold on.
There is a percentage of the Muslim population that are definitely antagonistic toward us, and it is unfortunately a war that we have to fight and have to be aware of the combatants.
Because many of the teachings of Muslims in the Quran and in the Hadith are things that I strongly disagree with, and that would take our Constitution and our Bill of Rights and make them nothing but a happy memory. And if Muslims are on a plane dressed as Muslims, you can be sure that they are in favor of Sharia law, and Sharia law would remove all of your protections under the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And what I recommend to the people who made this survey, if you disagree with that statement, then what you should do for yourselves is read the Quran and the Hadith like I did and study Sharia law in some of these countries where it is being practiced, and you would realize what a threat this is to America, and it's something that we really, truly need to address soon.
Again, so this is not somebody that just was like, ugh. This is a well thought out, well structured attitude, right? This is somebody who's thought about this.
Well, it's a shame, but you got extreme Muslims that their goal is everybody's going to be Muslim or they're going to be dead. And once they get that goal, then they're going to instill their extreme Muslim beliefs. I don't think as a free world or a free country, we should be under that threat. So saying that the Muslims are a threat to the world economy, the world as we know it, and they are a threat, and they need to be dealt with. And the Muslims that don't feel that way need to stand up and join us. And then maybe we can have harmony because we have a common goal. It's the Muslim extremists that's getting all the press, and they need to be dealt with. They need to be exterminated. Their beliefs.
So these are different. These are threat-based ones. And now listen to the political correctness ones. They're threat-based, but this is a discussion of political correctness in a different than what you heard about First Amendment.
because we are American, and every American, if they wanted to speak their heart instead of what's politically correct, would say that when they get on an airplane, they too are scared of people in Muslim garb. And that is speaking honestly, not some color-coded what is politically correct. Thank you.
So long as you're telling the truth, they did bomb us. They did kill over 3,000 people. They're killing people all over the United States. Not all Muslims are bad, but let them say the truth, what's going on. It's not anybody else that's blowing us up. Even now, they send out 20 bombs to kill us.
Because I think that it's time that we call a spade and tell things as they are. I don't think we have to worry about I don't think we should have to worry about constantly being politically correct. This country has been attacked and will be attacked again, and we've been attacked by Muslims. And it's unfortunate if innocent Muslims are offended by comments made by newspaper people and TV people, but that's just how it is. We need.
So, okay, one more here.
Because I think ever since Barack Obama and this administration got into the White House, they've been extremely soft on Muslims. And, although they are the ones that attacked us on 9/11, if you need to say Muslim terrorists, which I think is ridiculous because everybody knows they're a terrorist, why should you have to say that? I just think ridiculous. And no, I don't like them and never will.
So the issue here, again, is that when we talk about political correctness, this has been part of the separate worldviews for much longer. This was 6 years ago. And the issue, of course, aiming the other side, is a real sense that this is inappropriate, that this is anti-American itself, to be questioning people and be questioning freedom of religion. And so we have a two-way street here of one side saying your political correctness is threatening me. One of the surveys that during the 2016 election showed that Trump voters, 76% of them thought they were under immediate threat of terrorism, they themselves, individually. Whereas only like 20-some% of Clintons. Despite, if you look at the coast, New York City, the support breakdown, these are real thoughts, these are real threats. On one side, a threat to my way of life, so the opposing side views this as a threat to the American way of life, just in the same verbal ways you hear that. And so all we're doing is getting this cycle to go deeper, right? We're using symbols here I want to go back to that one. I mean, if you look at, how can you use the Statute of Liberty in both ways? I mean, we're viewing the other set of views as a threat to the way of human life, or our American way of life, and a threat underneath. So this is no easy way out, right? Now, I didn't do those cartoons, but I did the other stuff. But so where do we end up here for the outlook? It's not good, I think. We started that way. But the real situation here is, again, we overly personify things. It's a much nicer story to say Donald Trump and Trump voters, when in fact we have been creating and recycling against each other these divisions for 40 years. We've not resolved the issues that drive them further, right? So we're likely to see them continue. Obviously, Donald Trump was central casting for this because of his positions, to walk in and wipe away his own partisans on these very issues, right? This is noteworthy. I mean, to remember, he won certainly the Republican nomination and the presidency, but he ran against everything that the party stood for in 2004, the last time and the only time they won a majority of the presidency since 1988. He turned his Iraq, all this other stuff, I mean, just absolutely turned his back on what the party had stood for and wiped the floor with them, right? So the low approval ratings, one other thing that has to do with this worldview separation. There's a deeper set of issues that those voters that are on this the more law and order, social status quo, they care less about public opinion being reflected in public policy. So their attentiveness right now, as we hear, well, his low approval rating goes up, that doesn't matter as much to them. That is not what drives them. They have less of a connection between a need for public policy and public officials to necessarily be in the public. So that's not going to injure him among his own people, who still strongly support him, by the way. That's the way it is. This is a worldview divide in a different way than an ideological divide. If we want to talk about capital gains taxes, we're missing what the divide is here, to be sure. And I think as we see people's views of political correctness and our misunderstanding of how deep and different we talk about it from each other, that again, this is a notion that it's a threat and a threat to the American way of life on both sides. One side views what they see as intolerance, accepting of a multicultural society, of a pluralistic society. They view these things as a threat. On the other side, they view the pushing of a multicultural society as a threat to the American way of life. And political correctness as shrouding this. And again, this didn't start this year. So the idea here is that both sides feeling threatened by the other side continues the cycle, rips down trust, and again, the off-ramps aren't easily there. I really thought deliberation and political disagreement were going to be a way out of it, but even that didn't show up. So that's where we are. So good times. Questions? Good to come up to the mic. Ask them if you would.
Thanks. I'll put us a little closer here. We talk about compromise and we talk about how polarized our society is and so on. How can we conceive of compromise without even thinking of information and context that people kind of relate to in order to form their worldviews? How can we, consider those as, just people without the context of the others? Can you comment on that? Because if there should be compromise, shouldn't there be also kind of an addressing off the point of, news sources or information, how these people build their worldviews? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we go back here to this, we asked people too where they got their information, and clearly the segmentation of the media market and the internet and everything else furthers this. The anti-Muslim view, even the earlier studies that show it, if you watched some of the network TV things in the 24 and stuff like that, they said that this furthered people's kind of fear and stuff like that. We also are more segmented into our own, and this is part of the political science literature, that we're sorting ourselves into separate communities based on lifestyle that actually bleeds over into partisan. You kind of know where you are, and you know if you fit there, is the argument. And so we are further separating ourselves. So if you live in Texas and you're a liberal, you go to Austin. If you're conservative in Austin, I'm going to Dallas, man, getting the hell out of here. Orange County versus LA. And the research here is disturbing because I keep saying that's not going to happen. And then I have a couple of friends that do this stuff, and they have it down with big data now to purchasing, Walmart, how the percentage of Walmarts in an area versus Trader Joe's. I mean, things that you'd say, no, come on, we can't. In fact, it's there. So, but one thing we have to remember is people are also seeking out. So there's some agency in the media that they are seeking out. So it's not just being beamed out and accepted. People are now able to choose it. And one interesting study difference in 20 years between the 1992 election and 2012 election in the American National Election Study. In 1992, like 60% of the American public hated the media system in the United States. In 2012, it had turned around where they were happy. Why? Because they didn't have to watch those stupid network guys being negative to my side, the objective, more objective news sources. Instead, they could go to the side they wanted. Well, it's much more satisfying, right? So there's a two-way street here with that as well, right? The context behind it is absolutely, is to be sure. So I agree with you.
But where do we go from here? Because this is about to implode if it hasn't already.
No, that's exactly where do we go from here. Because I would have said, watch the PBS NewsHour and talk to people you disagree with, and maybe you'll come to something. And then I find this, and I'm like, oh, some of it's a bad place. I'm never going to say better objective information is not good, and political disagreement and engaging is not good. Of course it is. I do think it's the silver bullet if we can get it loaded, but it's a tough thing, So yes, Lee. Sure, or just scream.
I can try to scream. The people who judge Islam to be a threat, is there any data that you know or any information, any research out there that says how many of them have children or have themselves or have friends who have been, say, in Iraq or something and have felt threatened because they or their loved ones were at war?
No, I mean, the research is pretty rich on this about people's experiences in areas that we didn't go in. But the experience, this authoritarian, by the way, the measure for authoritarianism, the law and order as I prefer versus those against that, is really actually a measure of set of child rearing things. Do you want a child to be well-behaved, or do you want creativity or something like this? And it's terrible because that is, again, one of these examples of a concept being measured by an indicator that's maybe not the best, but they keep finding that it does. But no, there's no conditional thing to what you're saying, I think. There's no common kind of, and again, as I mentioned, it's, finding these divides is not easy. These are well thought. I think if you heard that, I was trying to show here, we actually got turned down for an article 3 years ago on this because we weren't being fair enough to those people that were the political correctness. They were all right with the threat things, but they said we weren't being fair. And we said, this is their voice. We didn't say that this is a worldview. This is a legitimate worldview that we have. We didn't make this up. We're not being critical toward this worldview. This worldview is as it is. And if we, would say, well, we're going to teach it out of them, educate, they want to do the opposite. The two sides are pushing each other, right, in this. So we thought, well, let's just send it back to them, to the editors, and say, well, what do you think now, right? If this is, yeah. Other questions? Yes?
Given the two worldviews, it seems to me that this is kind of, at the base of it, a collective subjectivity almost. What do you see, what comes to mind is Hannah Arendt's banality of evil. What do you see as might be a countervailing force in the society, institutionally, that would bring some sort of challenge to this worldview divide?
One that political scientists talked about is to have a realignment, to have a real out-and-out party stand up and somebody lose on this or not. Now, this is because in the past, obviously, we've seen large-scale issues really not go down easy. Even if we were in a situation like the Depression, the 1890s, and populism, and 1860s, I mean, Civil War. These are deep issues then as well. So we're not in uncharted territory as far as the depth of the issue. And the argument is one side winning and really breaking apart the party system is the way out for party people. But this divide's still there, I think. And so I don't have an answer, to be honest, of how we get out. I mean, these are deeply and well-structured attitudes. So I'm not sure if there is. So I don't have a very good answer. I'm sorry. But it's the one hope is that a realignment, one way or the other, will at least set us on a path to be able to debate this and have people have political consequences on one way or the other to this. So, yeah.
Well, for half my life, I lived under one-party system, communist country, and it seems like the other half, living under bipartisan or two-party system, seems to bring that lack of compromise. And you actually did start possible realignment as breaking up the parties into 3, 4. What's your thought about, could this really bring that necessary compromise for the future?
Well, there are, there were some scholars that thought this was going to be a realigning election because Donald Trump was going to get smoked, and that was going to put the end to the Republican Party. They're on record. I mean, think tank people. These aren't just, people shooting from the hip. And obviously it didn't happen like that. And so there are cases, obviously third parties popping up and running and winning. The Republican Party, for instance, in 1860, coming from nowhere. But whether or not that's brewing right now, I mean, the other component is we're not engaging, the two political parties aren't engaging new voters. The millennials out here know this. You've not been asked how, will you support our party? They're ignoring main issues, and I'm not talking some Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton thing. I'm talking about not trying to get new voters. They've gotten down to a science how to mobilize people, and this stuff works. They haven't reached out to voters that this stuff might not work, so we don't know. I mean, millennials are all over the place, and they're going to be the biggest modal group in the American electorate soon. They've not been asked to participate in American politics yet. They haven't. They haven't been approached. They've been not targeted purposely. We used to have both parties crawling this campus asking for people to vote. Did you see anyone trying to get students? Anyone ask you to vote? Anyone come to campus? In 2004, they were darkening my door all the time looking for it. So, the hope is maybe, I guess, to break through or to come up with some way to address these divisions is mobilizing others. Yeah, probably. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first one is, what do you think or were any of the statistics, was there a factor in there for having an African-American elected twice on this cycle that was going, and then a female candidate in 2016, if you're looking at your acceleration? And then the second one was, right before I came here today, I was listening to the Senate Intelligence Committee talk about, they were putting out some facts about the Russians, and apparently part of this is exactly what they like and are exploiting. So is there any discussion and talk about what that will mean to the natural progression that you political scientists are watching and having, or is there any precedent for having an outside influence like that?
Yeah, well, to the first part, I mean, Barack Obama race and the studies done, there's a complicated set of things that mobilize people in this election and others. And some of it has to do with this worldview, right? And the issue of race that we haven't come to a conclusion about. The literature's deep and it's a complex thing. It's been too easily on both sides thrown away when, in fact, probably two of the greatest political scientists in the 1990s spent a decade writing these amazing books that took very different views. One side saying that we're using coded words to kind of mobilize people racially, right? The other side saying, no, these are American values that people think are very important, that they think are lacking. And so, in fact, we've been over this, political scientists are not very exciting, and neither are our conferences. But if you went to one of those panels, because you're talking about people, the greatest political scientists, there's one from Stanford and one from Michigan, and they are going at it about whether this is an reflection of American way of life or some coded racism. And they have the best data in the world, and there's no consensus. So that's on that. I mean, that's so extremely cautious. On the other issue, the thing about this is it gives you license as well. Social psychological identifications give you a lot of license. As I tell my students, I'm a Detroit Lions fan. I'm still a fan. There's no objective reason to be a Detroit Lions fan. We do strange things with our behavior out of identities. And when you identify partially based on real world things, you take that social psychological identification and you go further. And in this sense, how you can turn, for instance, from on the Democratic side wanting a reset with Russia, and hey, it's not that bad and not that bad. We're not going to say anything. When Jeb Bush was here, he told my students, the biggest thing about this election is how much Russia's messing around with it. The Democrats didn't say much about that, right? And been more open. And the Republicans always hard line against the Russians. Now we see everyone taking an opposite. The biggest threat in America is Russia to the Democrats. 10 years ago that would have been, Mitt Romney said that they were, and people said, no, that's a joke. Are you kidding me? The Democrats laughed at him 4 years ago. They're not laughing right now. And Republicans, when did Vladimir Putin become popular? So in other words, our social psychological identifications drive us to towards subjectivity rather than objectivity, and further this then, because then we make arguments that aren't consistent and further upset the other side, to be sure. Yeah.
If it does end up, let's just go to the realm of imagine that it really is, that there does become something that shows that what they said this morning, is that not perhaps something that might start realignment?
It could be, yes, to be sure. But on the other side, it's going to take a long way to get there, because that negative partisanship thing, it was still okay. And Donald Trump, I'm not criticizing the one side or the other here, but he said, "Hooray for WikiLeaks" during the election. People are okay now, much more satisfied with, okay, the Russians aren't that bad. Vladimir Putin. That is a change, right, in that of a long cushion you've allowed yourself to move on an issue that has been part of American life since 1947, right, a deep divide. So I'm not sure whether that will disrupt this or not. So, yes, can we take one more? Okay.
I guess it's pretty good. For those of us in the room that haven't lived through protests and things like that, and seeing that become more popular, has your research shown that it's effective? I mean, for those in the room that maybe are participating in a protest for the first time, is that something that does make a difference? And is it encouraged? I mean, you get people on both sides of the street on that, and so just wondering. Protests
are extremely effective. Protests send us along on these issues because we look at Vietnam, we look at civil rights, we look at all of these issues that we say are now unresolved. They started out, these are people that were locked out of power, right? And protest brought the issue into a saliency that made the elites pay attention. They didn't resolve them fully, but they paid attention to them. And one of the different things that actually the incivility thing, because we've actually written about why incivility is good in a lot of occasions. We kind of, normatively say, well, you got to be civil. Civility is really good for those in power that want to shut up people without power, right? So it has its role, and it's extremely important. That's why protest is extremely important. Some of the differences we have now is that when we looked in the past at this grassroots kind of component and uncivil actions were very important, and they remain so. The difference is that this used to be kind of against elites, or as Jefferson said, about Shays' Rebellion and the Tree of Liberty. He said, it's no big deal. It's whatever. Don't overreact. Pacify them. Teach them. This is a political elite saying, our job is to, as elites, he said they're as passionate as they are dumb about the issue. He really uses pejorative language about how mistaken Shays' Rebellion is, but he said, it's okay. You got to teach it out of them, right? Instead, we have elites throwing gas on fires these days, right? And that is the kind of thing that maybe is different. We've always had McCarthyism. We always, I'm going to overreact here, but the notion is that it seems it's a useful, again, incivility is a useful political tool right now. It's not a personal response. When I had those things up there, we left that whole answer about changing American way of life. That's what you hear on TV. Oh, we're uncivil now because we're not like the older generations, or these people aren't like. It has nothing to do with that. And people know where to blame it. It has to do. So that's the only caution I'd say is that protests definitely work, and they're very important ways to check power. But what's weird is how elites have kind of used this instead of, again, to pacify and teach it out of them to, in fact, increase it, right? Which then, again, continues this cycle on both sides of viewing the other side as a threat, right? So.
Thank you.